Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 259. This week the questions are taken from Guide 316 and 317, that's the guide to the Swedish cruiser Gotland and the guide to the Kaiser class battleships of World War I Germany, together with the Wednesday videos on Admiral Nimitz and USS New Jersey, and a guest question from the Learning About the Imperial Japanese Navy video, which was on a Friday. Primark 359 asks, I love the tongue-in-cheek description of the Gotland as a battlestar. Are there any other ships that could also have this appellation applied to them, or is it unique? Well, in terms of, the reference I made being that, the Battlestar has armour, it has guns, it has fighters, it slices, it dices, it makes julienne fries. Gotland, as a ship designed from the start for this, really only shares that pedestal with two others, both of which are actually Japanese. That's being the Tone class heavy cruisers and the Oyoro class light cruisers, which, similar to Gotland, have a heavy battery of guns up front and the ability to launch and recover a reasonably sized air group for their size of float planes aft. And of course they have armour, they have anti-aircraft firepower, etc, etc. Now you could argue that the Megami was refitted to Battlestar-like specifications, and of course the Issei and Hyuga, which you can see in the picture here, were also refitted to similar spec. Now there are a few borderline cases. The New Orleans class cruisers, for example, carried 4 aircraft amidships, but I think the 4 aircraft on a heavy cruiser is probably pushing the upper limits of regular cruiser as opposed to the lower limits of mini Battlestar, which I think you probably need at least half a dozen aircraft for that, but that's my opinion anyway. There are also a few ships post the period the channel covers, i.e. post 1950, that might merit a similar designation, but of course that's post the channel period, so not going to cover them here. BK Zhang asks, you've discussed previously that the Shokakus were the Japanese carrier equivalents to the Yamatos, i.e. built to outmatch the opposition individually to compensate for their limited construction capability. Whilst the Shokakus did prove to be some of the most effective and useful capital ships of World War II with a good track record of durability and causing enemy loss, considering that they seem to be roughly equal to the Yorktowns, would you argue the Japanese failed to get their supercarriers that they wanted with the Shokakus? I wouldn't necessarily say the Japanese failed to get what they were looking for with the Shokakus, because if you compare their actual statistics, the Shokakus are just flat out better as ships than the Yorktowns. Of course, you can utilise the Yorktowns slightly differently and have better damage control, etc. But in terms of the actual ships themselves, Shokaku is faster. Shokaku is significantly more heavily protected. Shokaku is, even at the start of the war at least, significantly more heavily armed. She has twice as many heavy anti-aircraft guns as the Yorktowns, and the layout of that armament is very similar. They're both split down either side. You don't have the twin turrets fore and aft of the island the way you would on later ships like the Essex. And the Shokakus have significantly more hangar space in terms of hangar area. The Shokakus are not quite double, but closer to double than 1.5 times the hangar space of a Yorktown class. So, if you swapped, the US would take the stats of a Shokaku every day above the stats of a Yorktown. That's not exactly surprising, considering that the Shokakus are, well, if they're at full load, they're about 7,000 tons more than a Yorktown. So, shockingly, 7,000 tons buys you a lot of extra capability. However, you do have a bunch of limitations that come with the Shokakus that are more down to Japanese doctrine and usage than anything else. Of course, the Americans are storing aircraft in the upper portions of their hangar. They've got an extensive deck park as well. And although both sides do start off the war with a significant number of their aircraft in a fixed-wing configuration, the Japanese have the slightly more crucial issue of the folding wing variants of various Japanese aircraft not actually folding that close in, which means that they still occupied more space, and various doctrinal issues about how you store aircraft and where you store aircraft meant that, although in theory if you stored aircraft American style on a Shokaku class, you could get a lot more aircraft in. They didn't get so many aircraft in. So despite their, on paper, greater capacity, the Japanese Navy operated the Shokakus in a way that actually meant quite often they had slightly fewer aircraft aboard than a Yorktown, even though the Yorktown was significantly smaller. And to be completely fair to the Shokakus, given that they were having bombs lobbed at them by the Americans that were significantly heavier than the bombs the Japanese were lobbing at the Yorktowns, and the Shokakus, as you mentioned, survived a fair while under that kind of battering, whereas obviously both Hornet and Yorktown were gone in the first full year of the Pacific War, I'd argue the Shokakus actually showed that they were considerably more resilient, which doesn't actually make too much of a surprise, considering that they are also, as we mentioned earlier, significantly more heavily protected. So overall, I would say the Japanese did get the qualitatively superior carriers they were looking for, but through a combination of issues with the aircraft, their general aircraft doctrine, and other softer factors like damage control doctrine and so forth, they frittered away some of the bigger advantages that you might get from a carrier of this size and capability, to the point that they were perhaps operated in a way that was only marginally better at times to the much smaller Yorktown. Rickard Warren asks, have you found anything about the Swedish Navy during the World War I, World War II period that you didn't expect from such a small nation? Also, there have been rumours of Swedish battleship and carrier projects. Can you shed any light on these? In terms of things that surprised me about the Swedish Navy, well, off and on I've looked at them a reasonable amount over the years. I think in terms of what I didn't expect from such a small nation was probably actually, if anything, the sheer level of determination that they had to defend their interests, because with a lot of smaller nations, you tend to see them either absolutely desperate to defend their sovereignty, but really go about it in some really bizarre ways that probably aren't going to work, usually trying to posture to scare people off when, everyone else is 10 times their size. A bit like when you get a very angry chihuahua trying to get you to back down, and you're sort of looking at it going, yes, I understand you could probably make a small mess of my ankles. However, also, if I kick you, that'll be the end of you, and you'll also go about 20 feet. So, that kind of hyper-aggressive but somewhat pointless posturing is somewhat common with small navies. Also, sometimes they tend to just go with big prestige pieces, which aren't necessarily about threat, but more about, like, look at the glory of our navy with its 4 ships, one of which is reasonably sized. Whereas the Swedes seem to have basically put all of that aside and just gone, no, we're going to have a small but fairly efficient navy. The designs themselves aren't going to be all that much to write home about in terms of absolute firepower, but they're going to be so heavily integrated into mutual support, both with each other and coastal defences, that the sum total of the plans become much, much greater than the individual parts. So I would say 1900s through 1950s Sweden is pretty much small navy coastal defence done right, and there's not many places that can say that. In terms of Swedish battleship and carrier projects, there are a few, but it depends very much on how you define battleship carrier. So this, for example, that you've been seeing on screen, is a design that I believe the Italians came up with for the Swedes. And it's technically a battleship in as much as the Sverige class obviously are coastal defense battleships, and this is not strictly an outgrowth of it, but as you can see, it is an expanded version. It has 6 guns in 3 twin turrets instead of 2 twins. But this thing is still only displacing about 17,000 tons. So we're still talking about a ship that it's displacing a lot more than a Sverige class, but it is displacing less than even HMS Dreadnought. So it's displacing about as much as a larger sized semi-dreadnought, I would say. If you want to call that a battleship, then yes, this is a Swedish battleship. If you want to call it a coastal defense ship or a particularly large cruiser, then I guess it could be those as well. But yes, something of the nature existed. And it's a similar story with carriers. There are a couple of Swedish proposals for aircraft carriers at various points during the time the channel covers, although details are somewhat sparse. But what details are available indicate that the carriers are, by any metric, relatively small ships. They're definitely not fleet carriers. They are small to medium-sized escort carriers, is what you probably classify them as. They're a little bit smaller than light carrier like the Independence, albeit one of the design dates from slightly before that. So you kind of call them coastal defense escort carriers, maybe. But in terms of, were the Swedes occasionally looking into some kind of ship with a through-length flight deck that operated aircraft and therefore is in some way, shape or form an aircraft carrier? Yes, they were, albeit it doesn't ever seem to have gone particularly far, because somebody, presumably in the Swedish Navy or the Swedish government, pointed out that an aircraft carrier is a tool for operating aircraft well away from shore, and the entire Swedish Navy is set up to defend close into shore, which would make a bit of a mockery of the whole concept, especially since for the price of a carrier that could operate a dozen aircraft, you could buy 3 dozen aircraft and operate them out of land bases instead. Henrik Brathen asks, I've heard from multiple sources that the German High Seas Fleet was conducting a training exercises in the North Sea before World War I, and that this was around Norway, but never where in Norway they were going to, or how far north they actually got before they turned around. Do you know where to find this information? Yes, so this was a relatively short-lived tradition of the High Seas Fleet. Sort of came about in the mid-1900s and obviously died away with the beginning of World War I. But they would sail from Germany. They would then conduct exercises. They'd pass obviously by Helgoland and conduct exercises off the Skagerrak. I think that's how it's pronounced. What we would call, in English, we would say it's the Jutland area, basically off Denmark. And then they would proceed north into Norwegian waters for further exercises. The various references to these cruises all seem to agree that the fleet sailed for, along with the Hohenzollern, I think that's how it's pronounced, the Imperial German yacht. Eventually their destination was a place called, and I apologise to Norwegians this time, Balholmen, which is a port in actually quite far into Norway geographically, almost as far from the coast as, in fact, maybe even slightly further from the coast than Oslo, as a fairly major fjord, and it's called Sognefjord, possibly. Again, apologies to Norwegians who are probably horrified by that. But if you want to find out where Balholmen is, basically look at a map of Norway, and if you're following up the west coast, you go past Stavanger, past Bergen, and once you go up past Bergen, basically as the coastline of Norway reaches almost its westernmost point before it starts to duck back in again at a kind of a northeasterly angle, you'll see a fairly wide opening for a fjord that runs, obviously a little bit zigzag, but runs basically dead east. Balholmen is about 60% of the way up that fjord. In terms of other things you might have heard of, it's at about the same latitude as Lillehammer, but Lillehammer is obviously much further to the west. So another way of finding it would be to find Oslo, go north to Lillehammer, and then go directly west, and you'll run into the fjord that Balholmen is on. So that's where the High Seas Fleet seems to have gone, as far as, you know, the furthest north, and then they come back again, albeit sometimes they go out to the Faroe Islands or something like that. So the very, very upper reaches of the North Sea, where the North Sea is turning into the Norwegian Sea. Josh Thomas Moore asks, why did the Lexingtons in their battlecruiser form have such a thin belt? They have barely more than the Invincible and Indefatigable classes, but those ships were never meant to fight ships with similar guns, and when they did, it didn't end well. So was the US not paying attention to Jutland, or was something else playing a role? I think it comes down to 3 things: technology, choices, and, to be perfectly honest, more than a little bit of willful blindness, the latter of which persists to this day with some people who defend the design. So the choices element. The US had 35-knot destroyers, they had 35-knot light cruisers coming on hand, the Omahas and the destroyers Wicks and Clemsons, and so they kind of got a little bit fixated on the idea of their fleet screen being 35-knot capable, and that meant the battle cruisers were going to be 35-knot capable, at least at the start of their design process. It eventually did come down to 33, but a lot of the design sacrifices were made because, of course, not only is 35 knots significantly faster than 30, 31, 32, 33, but it requires exponentially more power. And if you need lots and lots and lots of power, that means you need lots and lots of machinery. And that machinery takes up a lot of volume and it takes up a lot of weight. And you've put so much of your ship's displacement into speed, you now have only protection and firepower left to do, and one of those is going to have to be sacrificed in a big way, and they were not sacrificing on firepower. Bear in mind that in the final design configuration, the Lexingtons were within shouting distance of Hood in terms of overall displacement, except they were carrying a heavier armament, 8 16-inch guns instead of 8 15-inch guns, and they were several knots faster, at which point armour is going to have to go in that equation, because you physically can't fit everything on. You also have, so that's your kind of technology issues. You've got the choices issue. So part of it is a choice of, I initially want to go 35 knots, and eventually I'm going to have to sacrifice some of that, but not everything. But another element of the choice is what kind of systems you're using, because they could go for fairly standard geared turbines. Now, instead, they went for turbo-electric drive. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses of turbo-electric drive. That discussion has been had on the Drydock before. It is something of a slightly different issue. But in terms of what's happening specifically with the Lexingtons and why they have very little armour, specifically, the turbo-electric drive is heavier for a given power output. All else aside, whatever else you might want to say, per square foot per ton, a turbo-electric drive is a heavier set of machinery than a standard geared turbine drive. And that means that if you are already putting a fair bit of emphasis on speed and you're using an unusually heavy machinery plant, that's going to take up even more of your weight, which means even less displacement left over for your armament and your fire and your protection. And we've already established they're not skimping out on the firepower element, so the protection goes down still further. The inclusion of the torpedo tubes and so forth, and a relatively extensive secondary battery, yes, that would have added a little bit, but to be honest, you could have cut down the secondary battery from 14 guns to 12 guns. You could have reduced it from 6 inches to 5 inches. You could have eliminated the torpedo tubes entirely. The amount of weight that would have saved would not have been in any way, shape or form enough to substantially improve the Lexington's protection. Now, of course, when Hood showed up, which arguably was a somewhat better balanced design, the US did, by its own admission, take a lot of notes from Hood and try and incorporate them into what turns out to be the final version of Lexington, which is, roughly speaking, what you can see here. But there was only a limited amount you could do with that compared to, Hood's balance, because they weren't, as we said earlier, going to skip on the armament. They weren't going to skip on the speed, even if they'd been forced to drop down to 33 knots. And it's just the overall limitation things. But as for one of the many reasons why they weren't going to surrender any of the rest of that stuff, that comes over perhaps a bit to the willful blindness that I mentioned, in that you'll see some US Navy documents, not all, because they, as I said, they were concerned when they looked at Hood and realised how heavily protected she was, and they did try and upgrade Lexington's armour as much as they could, but some fairly strong elements of the US Navy at the time, and certainly some of the more extreme defenders of the Lexington design these days, will continue to insist that because she carries a CC designator and was supposed to be in the fleet screen, that any increase in armour beyond the 7 inches was not necessary, because she's part of the fleet screen operating with the effectively, not quite, but almost effectively unprotected Omahas and Wicks and Clemsons, and her role is not to fight in the battle line, her role is not to fight other battle cruisers, and therefore 7 inches of armour is more than adequate to protect her against destroyer and cruiser gunfire, and so there's nothing wrong with it. Which, frankly, is an absurd point of view, because, as I said, it's an example of willful blindness on multiple counts. One, your enemy is not going to obey your fleet stricture just because you want it to. Two, the fleet screen, where they're going to put Lexingtons, has been the domain of the battlecruiser pretty much since Invincible hit the water. At the point they were finally designing the last elements of Lexington, battlecruisers in some way, shape or form had for almost 15 years been significant elements of the fleet screen. The entire fight between the battlecruiser fleet and First Scouting Group had been because both of those battlecruiser formations were pretty much the core elements of the respective fleet screen. So the idea that just because you were using the Lexingtons as some kind of giant scouting cruiser, that they magically somehow wouldn't come across other battle cruisers doing exactly the same role, but with slightly less speed but considerably heavier protection and equal or greater firepower, is frankly an absurd position to maintain. Because, if she had gone out, then in the latter part of the 1910s and early 1920s, she would have run across the Congos and Hood, Renown, Repulse, etc. Now, granted, none of those ships, with the possible exception of Hood at long range, have anything like the protection to guard themselves against incoming 16-inch fire. But on the other hand, Lexington doesn't have the armour to protect herself against 14 or 15-inch fire either. And Lexington is the bigger, much more expensive ship. So your really big, really expensive 5 or so or more year, more advanced supposedly design, having to run away because it might get crippled or destroyed in a mutual destructive engagement with a much smaller, much older vessel, is not brilliant. And then, of course, if you fast forwarded to the time the Lexingtons probably would be coming into service, if they had gone to war with one of the big navies in the 1920s, then, obviously assuming no Washington Naval Treaty, you'd be looking at facing off against the Amagis or the G3s. And the Amagis, whilst being somewhat slower, therefore the Lexingtons could in theory withdraw, are actually better protected than the Lexingtons in terms of main belt armour, albeit admittedly neither side is particularly proof against 16-inch guns, but the Amagis are rocking out with 2 additional guns. So the chances of an Amagi, all other things being equal, scoring a hit on Lexington and doing some major damage before Lexington does the same to Amagi are, in the Amagi's favour. And then, of course, you have the G3 class, who are only a knot slower than the Lexingtons, so in terms of escape, etc., it's probably not enough of a speed margin to do that. And they are also rocking a slightly greater armament, 1 gun extra in their case, and they do have protection at reasonable battle ranges against 16-inch gunfire. So if you'd come up against an Amagi, the Amagi would have had a slight combat advantage against the Lexington, but the Lexington could at least withdraw. Against a G3, you can't run, you can't hide, and the G3 can tank your hits better than you can tank its by a considerable margin. And now, admittedly, the G3 is 5,000 tons heavier than the Lexington, so that's not necessarily surprising, but it is a fact that has to be acknowledged. And just pretending that because she's in the fleet screen she'll magically never have to engage anything that's flinging more than a 8-inch shell at her, that's not how you keep people alive. And obviously if you run away, you're not doing your job as a fleet screen, because all you can report at that point is the enemy had a better fleet screen than us. Well, where's the enemy fleet? I don't know, they're hiding behind their better fleet screen. And now you've given away the positional advantage to your opponent's fleet. PH89787 asks, hypothetically, had Enterprise been preserved as a museum ship, how do you see her configured in this role, and what exhibits and artifacts would you have aboard her? Well, Enterprise would have benefited from, if she'd been placed into a museum as a museum ship when the drive was almost there to get her into it, she would have been in a format that would have been essentially her end of World War II format, which would have actually put her at a significant advantage over the existing aircraft carriers in terms of history, because of course Midway is in her early 90s configuration, and Lexington, Hornet, Intrepid, Yorktown are all Essex class, and they're all in various SCB refit stages, mostly reflecting a kind of early to mid-Cold War setup. So preserving Enterprise as, if you want to maybe say, the only World War II aircraft carrier. Admittedly, all of those Essexes were in World War II, but they're no longer in specifically their World War II format. Enterprise in her World War II format, that's a particularly big selling point. How else would you configure her? Well, keep her in the state that she was in mothballs. Now, obviously, there's arguments to be had as to, was she in good material condition? How good material condition? There's all sorts of things to be said about that. But if we're assuming that she is turned into a museum ship, I wouldn't make any dramatic alterations. Aircraft carriers generally have quite the advantage when it comes to deciding their exhibits and artifacts, because of course they have a massive flight deck and a massive hangar, or in some cases 2 hangars, depending on the carrier, which they can use to just store things and display things in, which a lot of other ship types don't have. But with her being obviously such a vital part of so many different operations, everything from obviously the Doolittle raid to Midway to various battles in the Guadalcanal campaign and so on and so forth, I think, well, if it was up to me, how I would display her is I would definitely have a B-25 on there. Now, of course, she took part in the Doolittle raid, but she was the escort, but Hornet is at the bottom of the ocean, so she is a Yorktown class, so having a B-25 on there to give people an idea of just what an issue that was to fit them on such a vessel would be a good idea. I think her upper deck, her flight deck, I would configure in a way that so kind of the aft section I would have showing some of her more notable feats, or her and her sister's more notable feats. So you'd have perhaps mark some of the areas where she was hit by bombs. Obviously have the B-25, as we just discussed. But then from maybe the aft of the island forward, have her set up almost as if she's, in some ways, almost as if she's in the middle of conducting flight ops. So you might have an Avenger, a Dauntless, and a Wildcat and Hellcat all scattered around, so very much her World War II air group. And then down in the hangar, which is enclosed to a given degree, that's where I would then store and display specific artifacts, battle flags, unique photos, physical objects from her various battles. If anything survives from battle damage components of her that were cut out during repairs and refits, include those. And she'd be, as long as you could ensure approximate conditions within the hangar in terms of atmospherics, probably also a good place to store a significant number of Japanese aircraft, as well as obviously, well, either nowadays a fake Devastator if you can get another one made, and the slightly less obvious aircraft that she also operated beyond the trifecta of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. But as I say, if you've got a Zero or a Val or a Kate, basically turn her into the Pacific Carrier War monument, essentially. That's what I would do with her anyway. Jennifer Clark asks, I found a letter from Fisher to Sturdee stating that Fisher would much rather have had Sturdee in command at Jutland than Beatty in hindsight. What is your reaction to this? I mean, I can't fault the argument. Sturdee was perhaps not the world's best staff officer or admiral to be, captaining a desk, but even his critics agreed he was a pretty good fighting admiral. And he had a few radical ideas about how to use his ships, so much so that, as I've covered before, when Sturdee was at Jutland, albeit in command of one of the battle squadrons as opposed to the battlecruiser fleet, Jellicoe kept him nice and close to make sure he didn't go herring off and do something particularly innovative with a good chunk of Britain's main battle fleet. However, if you look at the fact, one, he was willing to think things through, two, the fact that in the Falkland Islands, he used battlecruisers exactly as they were supposed to be used and ensured the pretty much complete destruction of von Speye's squadron. And 3, when you look at the post-Jutland Royal Navy in the latter part of the First World War, when Sturdee completely outmaneuvers Beatty and has Beatty dead to rights in Grand Fleet exercises, I think it's fair to say Sturdee was a far, far, far better fighting admiral than Beatty was. Apart from anything, even if he was only as good as Beatty, just by not having a failure of a signals officer, he would be better, but he was qualitatively a better fighting admiral, a better leader, a better tactician. So, if Fisher, and bear in mind, to be honest, Fisher saying this to Sturdee post-Jutland, that is, if that letter is accurate, that's a rather big statement, considering Fisher, when he first came back to office in 1914, absolutely hated Sturdee. A good chunk of the reason why Sturdee was sent to the Falkland Islands was because Fisher wanted Sturdee out of the Admiralty, and the balance that was struck was that, yes, Sturdee will leave the Admiralty, but he will get command of the battlecruisers going to avenge Craddock. But, I think at that point even Fisher could see what Beatty's mistakes had been. So, it's one of those great what-ifs of Jutland, because, as we know, one of the missed opportunities of the battlecruiser run to the south was the fact that Beatty didn't get his ships to open fire until the Germans were in range, when the British battlecruisers actually outranged the German. There were issues with the allocation of fire as well, the general training of the battlecruisers, the fact the 5th Battle Squadron wasn't actually sticking to them because of, again, poor signalling. So, if you want to be slightly optimistic, albeit not too much optimistic above the median, if Sturdee had been in command of the battlecruisers instead of Beatty, it's highly likely that 1st Scouting Group would have run into 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser Squadrons plus 5th Battlecruiser Squadron right from the beginning, which would have meant 1st Scouting Group is effectively facing a 2v1 scenario when the other side also has the 15-inch guns of the QEs nibbling away at the aftmost 2 German battlecruisers, which isn't going to end well for them. And the allocation of fire would probably have been better, and Sturdee probably would have also, I suspect, insisted, especially given his experience in the Falklands, on more accurate long-range fire being practiced for rather than just sheer speed. So overall, Sturdee should have been in command. Camarasite asks, I think we're all familiar with the duel between Massachusetts and Jean Bart during Operation Torch, and how Jean Bart was less damaged than it might have been because a number of 16-inch hits from Massachusetts were with shells that had dud fuses. This battle preceded Washington's destruction of Hiroshima by just a few days. Since there's no reason to think that Washington's fuses would have been any better, is there anything in the Japanese records or the wreck of Hiroshima that would indicate that some of those fuses did not function properly? No, the wreck of Hiroshima and the survivor accounts of Hiroshima seem to indicate that Hiroshima was pretty much torn apart very, very quickly. Now, granted, there may be 1 or 2 duds in there, who knows, but I don't think anyone sent ROVs into the shell holes in the wreck to see what's what, if indeed that is even possible. Because, of course, if it's a 16-inch shell that has exploded, there'll be lots of tangled wreckage, which would be very dangerous for an ROV. And if it's a 16-inch shell that didn't explode, in theory you should just have a series of slightly increasing diameter holes. And I'm not too certain that there are a huge number of reasonably capable underwater exploration ROVs which are narrower than 16 inches, but there you go. But no, generally speaking, Washington shells seem to have functioned pretty well. And there is a reason, I think, for this, which is, it's one of these devil in the detail things, because yes, Massachusetts shells did suffer an unusually high rate of duds, which meant that Jean Bart was, as you said, considerably more intact than she had any otherwise right to be. But the reason for the fuses being duds is the important thing. As far as I can tell from research, the reason for the fuses being duds in the Battle of Casablanca was that for various design reasons, the US fuses didn't do very well with impact at oblique angles at that stage, i.e. long-range, high-angle fire with a particularly dramatic angle of impact, which is exactly what Massachusetts was doing to Jean Bart. Essentially, the sideways shock either jammed the fuse or put the small train of explosive with the fuse out. Just didn't allow that initiation flame to reach the main detonator, which then would have exploded the shell, which is not an unknown type of fuse failure, but it is, I mean, it's happened to other navies at various times as well, but in World War II, it's a little bit less common, but nonetheless it did happen. The key thing there is the oblique angles of impact. As you can see from this photo of Washington actually firing on Hiroshima during that night, Washington was not firing at extreme long range, and therefore the shells were not hitting at a particular oblique angle. Washington, as you can see, is firing her guns with an elevation that is only marginally above near flat shooting, at which point the shells are going to be coming in and impacting at not quite perpendicular, obviously, but much closer to perpendicular angles than the shells from Massachusetts. And in a direct or near direct strike situation, the US fuses work perfectly fine. So I suspect that is the difference between the two engagements. Almost certainly using the same fuses, but Washington's fuses working much better because they're striking much more perpendicular. Unemployed History Major asks, Drac, since you mentioned crowdsourcing, would there be any interest or value if we crowdsourced some of the rare naval history books and then you use your connections to be able to publish them in a digital format to keep costs low? So there are basically two phases to this answer. For much older books that are out of copyright, and exactly what constitutes out of copyright can vary slightly by country, because you have multiple overlapping copyright laws passed in individual countries that can affect things, and also obviously what is out of copyright and public domain in the States may not be the same in the UK or vice versa. But there are a number of reasonably old books that are out of copyright, and although they're rare, if one was found, then yeah, publishing that in a digital format to keep costs down would be entirely doable. In fact, once it's out of copyright, if people crowdsourced a rare book and sent it to me, I think I would probably just scan it, digitize it, edit it, maybe throw in a few explanatory photos from my own collection, and then publish it myself, because that would be the single cheapest way of doing it, and e-publishing is, relatively speaking, easy to do. However, that's one thing. So that's entirely possible. The other element, though, is the somewhat newer books, because books basically, essentially, if they've been published post-1950 as a shorthand, they will generally still be in copyright, and therefore someone somewhere will have the publishing rights. Now, sometimes this is known who they are. Other times it's much more difficult. For example, Admiral Cowan's autobiography, I am 99% certain is still under copyright, but the company that published his autobiography seems to have gone the way of the dodo a long time ago, and I can't find any evidence of who bought up their publishing rights, if anybody did. And even if the publishing rights from a publishing company have lapsed, they will have returned to Admiral Cowan's estate, and I don't have the first clue as to who his direct descendants these days might be, who I could, if any, who I could write to and say, can I get publishing rights from you? If anybody does know, then drop me an email, and I'd love to get in contact with them, because that's one autobiography that definitely deserves publication. Nonetheless, when it comes to perhaps the more recent stuff, like, say, Japanese Cruisers of the Pacific War, which is a massive but very authoritative tome, the problem then becomes there are modern extant publishing companies that do have publishing rights, and obviously they are going to hold on to them. But a lot of publishing companies, you might be surprised to learn, don't actually do digital publishing for various reasons. So to get a more modern but relatively rare or expensive book republished would require either physical publication, because that's what the publishing house does, or it may be impossible because the publishing house can only print so many books per year, and they've then got to store and sell them. And if they don't think there's the market for a decent print run of those books, then obviously they're going to sit around in storage, which is going to be an expense for them beyond the publishing cost. And so they may not be willing to republish the book physically. And of course, if they don't do digital publishing or in some cases audiobook publishing, then it's not going to get republished. Now, that does bring up a few issues. Some publishing groups may be willing to sell the digital publishing rights. So it may be something that they're not willing to do, but they may be willing to sell it on. That's a possibility that could be investigated. And there are still further issues because, of course, if a publishing house is willing to sell its digital publishing rights, I guess, to me or someone similar, then what you're suggesting could be done. If they are not willing, then it's a dead end. If obviously they publish digitally themselves, then that's good. And then, of course, you've got audiobook publication, but not every book lends itself to that. So a history book like, say, Campbell's Jutland, an analysis of the fighting, that could probably be done as an audiobook if it hasn't been done already. Whereas Japanese Cruisers of the Pacific War, it's a much larger, much more technical thing. People want to reference specific pages. It has a lot of diagrams. That kind of book doesn't translate very well into an audio book format. So I would say, in principle, yes, there would be an interest and value in crowdsourcing rare books and then trying to get them republished. However, I think the first step on that road would be identify the book that you want to acquire, find out who has the publishing rights, and then inquire from them, basically, do you do digital publishing? Would you be willing to republish physically? Or if the answer is no to either of those, would you be willing to sell or the digital or audio, if relevant, publishing rights to a third party? And if that's yes, then if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then we can proceed. But if it's no to all of them, then it's probably not worth spending the money on the book unless you really, really like the book. J. Mace asks, during the age of steam and steel, in surface battles where battleships were not present, did cruisers take over the role of battleships, as in being the ships that would form the battle line? And if so, did destroyers take over the role of forming a screen, or did they still carry out their traditional role, or did they carry out another role? Pretty much as you first described. In scenarios where there weren't battleships and there were sufficient smaller vessels, they tended to just form battle lines and have a go at each other that way. Not necessarily all the time, but quite frequently, even as far back as the Age of Sail. If you had two squadrons of frigates fall into action with each other, they tended to just form two little lines of battle of frigates and blaze away at each other for a good little while. And in both the First and Second World War, when you had multiple cruisers come into contact with each other, maybe 3 or 4 per side or more, again, they tended to just default to dropping into a battle line. Now, of course, if you've only got 1 or 2 cruisers per side, it's difficult to form a line of 1. And even if you've got, a pair on each side, there's much more room for maneuver going on. But once you start to get anything that could credibly be called a line, like, let's say 3 or 4 minimum, because let's face it, even 2 ships, is 2 ships in a line actually a line, or is it, because technically speaking, 2 ships in close formation in any potential permutation of direction could be considered a line. But yeah, with 3 or 4 ships or more, you would generally see the cruisers or frigates, as applicable to the time period, form something resembling a battle line. At which point, yes, the destroyers would form the fleet screen, albeit obviously with battleships, destroyers would still be part of the fleet screen, just along with the cruisers. And even in some destroyer battles, you saw line actions between multiple destroyers when they were present in large enough formations, although with the sheer agility of destroyers, that did tend to break down somewhat quicker than the cruiser battle lines did. Although the flip side to that is, of course, that given the relatively closer capabilities between most cruisers and most destroyers for a large portion of the early part of the 20th century, you did also tend to see some, as you mentioned, other roles wherein if you were looking at a full battle line, if a group of enemy light combatants was getting too close, then more of your own light combatants would be scrambled to go and deal with them, and worst case, the secondaries and maybe even the primary batteries of your battleships would open up on them. But the battleships, unless they saw torpedo launches in the water, generally wouldn't change formation. Whereas when you have a group of mixed cruisers and destroyers fighting a miniature line action, if a group of enemy destroyers or one or two cruisers gets a bit too close for comfort, very often you will actually see the cruisers break from their line, or at least the nearby cruisers break from their line and start charging in amongst the destroyers, laying waste as much as they can to all around them. Trevor Polasek asks, could the engines of a battleship be used to power a train or another land vehicle? I mean, technically yes, but practically no. The reason there's a submarine in the picture is, of course, because a good number of submarines were powered by diesel engines that were derived directly from railway diesel locomotives. So there's an obvious answer. The diesel engines of submarines could be, but in terms of battleships, well, the most powerful steam and diesel locomotives ever put onto track have a power range that's measured at around 8 to 10,000 horsepower. That is the kind of horsepower you get out of an early 1900s destroyer. And we're talking about diesel engines of the 21st century and, mid-20th century onwards steam engines. And with the destroyer, you're talking about, a steam power plant that's half a century to a century earlier, depending on which exact engine you're looking at. Now, there are steam power plants in battleships that are of approximately the same total power output, but you have to start looking in battleships about as far back as the late 1880s, early 1890s, and because of obviously the miniaturization in power plant that's gone on between then and even the 1940s and 1950s steam engines on land, you're talking about a power plant that is far, 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 far too large to fit on any kind of practical steam train, let alone any other land vehicle, because they generally all tend to be smaller than that. Theoretically, if you go back far enough to the really early days of ironclad ships, so some ships of the line or ironclad battleships, whatever you want to call them, were actually powered by locomotive engines. Again, therefore, obviously, quite clearly, those engines could be used on a train, but it's only those very occasional touches with the land-based side of things. Theoretically, I suppose you could take almost any battleship power plant and stick it on an arbitrarily large vehicle. So if you wanted to run something like Bagger 288 or a NASA Space Shuttle Transporter Crawler off of a battleship power plant, you probably could, although I rather suspect you might have far too much power from the battleship power plant than you actually need in that machine, albeit the idea of getting one of those massive NASA rocket crawlers tootling around at 30 to 40 mile an hour, courtesy of a severely overcharged power plant, does amuse me for the 5 seconds that run would probably last. Vinve asks, did any navy have a ship's equivalent to the British Army's PALS battalions in World War I or World War II? In other words, are there modern examples of warship losses that took an unreasonable toll on a single community? Not strictly, no. However, for a good chunk of the period that we're referring to, ships tended to be crewed mostly, not entirely, because obviously officers could be sourced from almost anywhere, but the majority of a ship's crew would be sourced from one of the Royal Navy's major bases, so Chatham, Devonport, etc., etc. And most of those places either tended to recruit from the immediate local area, whether that be southeast England, southwest England, Scotland, the Midlands, etc., etc., or they received intakes of people who'd all been recruited at roughly the same time from roughly the same place when the Royal Navy was doing a recruiting drive, who tended to come, obviously, therefore, from roughly the same area. So if a ship was a Portsmouth-crewed ship, then there would be a higher than average number of people from Portsmouth, Gosport, and the other surrounding areas in Hampshire, and so on for the different bases, which meant that if a ship went down with a very large loss of life, there usually, if it was a ship of any particular size, there usually would be a somewhat disproportionate impact on a specific area. Whether it was down to a disproportionate impact on a specific community was pretty much, very much luck of the draw. But that could occasionally happen. Obviously, it depends on the size of the community. If it's a village of a few hundred, then, half a dozen men who all signed up together, who may have managed to get an assignment on various places within the same ship, that could have a very disproportionate impact on that community. Whereas if you're talking about a city the size of something like London or Liverpool or Manchester, half a dozen men from that entire settlement not making it back because one ship's gone down is almost just a blip on the radar, whereas several hundred from the same city, that might make a big change. Of course, in other navies, you may have very much different impacts, or you may have a much more concentrated impact. I've certainly come across a few instances of US Navy ships having a very high proportion of crew from the same state, although how far further down that goes into various specific towns, I'm not sure. Vokir asks, Quay, wharf, dock, pier, jetty, etc. What are the differences, and how would you see each used in a typical naval base? The problem is that the meaning of words shifts over time, so a wharf, on its oldest definitions, almost certainly refers to a structure that sticks out of the land against which ships can dock. The problem is that the dictionary definition of a quay these days is a long structure, usually built of stone, where boats can tie up to take on or take off their goods. Now, a quay could therefore also be a wharf, or a wharf could also be a quay. These days, wharves are generally held to be more areas where cargo vessels are, whereas quays are held to be in smaller harbours, but technically speaking, their original definitions were very, very similar. Another option is that quays are sometimes described as facilities where ships would lie parallel to the shore, but at the same time you can also find quays that perhaps curve, and so not all ships can dock parallel to shore or even close to shore, or you can have a quay that is a quay on one side and a seawall or breakwater on the other. Now, the other three terms were somewhat in better luck. A dock is generally held to be the larger enclosed space in which ships come to anchor. So a dock may contain quays, wharfs, piers, jetties, etc. But in and of itself, unless, again, you get something like a long seawall with docking facilities on the inside of it, the dock in and of itself usually isn't something that you attach yourself to, but it can happen. A pier is very specifically a projecting form of structure that's on pillars or legs, and a jetty is a small protuberance off of a quay, a wharf, or a pier. So sometimes you will see a quay, a wharf, a pier, whatever, some form of projecting structure, and then instead of having ships come and just dock alongside this single long projecting structure, you might have multiple smaller extensions of that coming off of it at right angles, and ships may either, depending on how they're loading and unloading, may either just dock at the very end if they're just offloading people, or they might come in and park almost like cars in a car park in between these little projections, and those individual projections would be then jetties. So within a typical naval base, the dock would be the larger structure of enclosed, calmed water with its breakwater or seawall or whatever, and you may be able to dock with the dock walls, you may not, but then within the dock there will be piers and or wharves, and potentially projecting off of those wharves or piers there may be jetties, so you may come alongside the pier or come alongside the wharf directly, or as just described, you may park inside next to a jetty, and there may be small jetties and quays which might allow for the docking of smaller vessels like minesweepers, tugs, ship's boats, and that kind of thing. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, in the May Patreon video, Drydock episode 249 part 1, at 1 minute 17:03, you answer a question that shows the turret of a US armoured cruiser. There are 3 rangefinder hoods, but the turret only has 2 guns. Why don't the numbers match? Essentially redundancy. You'll see this quite a lot if you look at something like the main class battleships, that's US pre-dreadnoughts, or even HMS Dreadnought herself. You'll see that 3 rangefinder or sighting hoods with one either side of a 2-gun or twin-gun turret and another in the middle between the guns is actually relatively common in this time period, and it's purely down to the idea that if you lose one, then another can take over. Now, obviously, you can see here in the exercise, they're using the left hand and right hand most in their exercise, and that is, of course, then the ones that would be used by default for the guns in question. But by having this center one, it means that either you can have all 3 occupied, at which point you have 3 points of data to cross-check, which is obviously useful, because if you just have 2, well, if one of them's wrong, how do you tell which one? Whereas if you have 3, then if the 3 different people in the 3 different sighting or range-finding hoods will give their opinion and 2 of them agree and 1 of them doesn't, then it's relatively certain the 2 who agree have probably got the right of it. And even if you don't have them all manned at once and you're just relying on the 2 on either side, for whatever reason, then, well, if one of them gets knocked out, then you have a central one which can give data to either gun. I mean, technically speaking, the one on the far left could give data to both guns or vice versa, but being in the center is somewhat easier. It's also the only other available space for the extra redundancy. So that's essentially why. Chief Eyeroll asks, you've recounted SMS Goeben, the Imperial German Navy battlecruiser sold, quote-unquote, to the Ottoman Empire, and whose admiral, captain and crew stayed on the reflagged ship. During the period you cover, did the British or other major navies also sell any significant warships with captain and crew in a similar fashion? And if so, was it a temporary or long-term sale? There's not many cases quite as blatant as Goeben, where a major warship from a foreign power just happens to be randomly and arbitrarily sold to another foreign power and keeps pretty much the entirety of its original crew on board, and who then proceed to perhaps, shall we say, take more confirmation of their final orders from their original home country than the home country they're currently serving in. But in terms of similar sales where you kind of get a warship plus crew, that does happen occasionally with other nations. Not so much in World War I, because the sale of Goeben is very much forced by circumstances. And obviously the British in World War I are more interested in getting their hands on every single warship they possibly can. However, if you go slightly further back in time, you will find Royal Navy sailors, or ex-Royal Navy sailors officially, perhaps with entire officer cadres as well, coming over to serve aboard warships that are owned by foreign nations in various South American wars, Lord Cochrane being a particularly good example, and also in wars across the planet. Greco-Turkish wars, Turco-Syrian wars, Texas versus Mexico, etc., etc., etc. Now, sometimes it's a case of a British officer corps showing up and then recruiting their friends and recruiting some other sailors they know to form a crew. Sometimes it's entire crews, from captain all the way down to enlisted, coming across on a single vessel to take up the command and crewing of a particular vessel that a nation happens to own. And very rarely, more so in the age of sail than anything else, you might have a warship that is built for a particular nation and is sold to a particular nation, and the company that has sold it might arrange, or very rarely the government in question, might arrange for a full or nearly full active crew of their own sailors, whether they be officially from that nation's navy, on half pay, or officially retired, to essentially man and crew the vessel as if it was of the original selling nation's navy, and then they ostensibly enter service with the other nation's navy. That's usually because the other nation doesn't have much, if anything, in terms of an experienced seaman corps, and the purpose of the crew is essentially to train the new country in its navy, which can be a short or long-term project depending on how well it goes. You also have various systems of naval attachés, naval representatives, etc., which can range from anything from a naval-oriented diplomat attached to the embassy all the way over to this person and a small group of people who work for them are officially attachés but actually happen to run the navy of the country that they're assigned to, because again that will have been something the country will have asked for, usually again newer navies starting up, or perhaps older navies that have fallen from grace and are looking for a way back up to a seat at the big table. In terms of direct contracts to supply men in such a fashion, these assignments usually didn't last too long, albeit that they were usually also in peacetime. That could be a few years. Occasionally they could last longer, albeit that was then normally be a private contract between individuals and the overseas government in question. Albeit that the very, very longest ones tended to be those kind of naval attachés running a navy kind of things, which could potentially last decades. And that concludes the Drydock for this week. We're actually almost spot on to an hour, so thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are, and I shall see you all again in another video at some point in the future, hopefully in a few days. Bye!